I'm Janice Stein, chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize. We are about to sit down and talk to Charles Kupchan, the author of Isolationism, a history of America's efforts to shield itself from the world. A compelling story of how isolationism was baked into American history almost from the earliest days. Hello, everyone. I'm Janice Stein, the chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize in partnership with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and with Foreign Policy. And with me is Charlie Kupchan, the author of Isolationism, a history of America's efforts to shield itself from the world. First of all, Charlie, let me tell you how much I enjoyed the book. It is entirely free of jargon. It's written in an engaging style which draws the reader in, and your love of history shines through on the pages. So congratulations to you on being a Lionel Gelber nominee.
Thank you very much, Janice. It's a pleasure to have the chance to chat with you today.
Charlie, tell me, what made you write this book? An enormous amount of research and archival work and writing goes in to produce a book of this quality. And you have to live with the book for such a long time while you're writing it. So what drove you to write this book?
Well, I think you're right, Janice, that I bit off more than I thought I was at the beginning, in the sense that, having lived through the end of the Cold War and then the reaction to 9/11, the forever wars, I began to ask myself whether the unstinting internationalism that I grew up with, and I went to grad school in the 1980s, I started teaching before the Berlin Wall came down, I began to say, is this going to last? Is this enthusiasm for going out and running the world going to last? Maybe not. Maybe people are going to get tired of this. And so I began to say, I'm going to go back and look at the pre-Pearl Harbor history of the country, the diplomatic history, the military history. And I have to say that my head exploded when I did, because the America that I was reading about had no resemblance to the America that I was living in and had grown up in. And that's because the country from 1789, really until Pearl Harbor, was isolationist. It was not interested in going out and entangling itself in the affairs of the world. If we were running the world after Pearl Harbor, we were running away from the world before Pearl Harbor. And that's when I started to really say, I think this is a topic that needs to be written about. And it's also when I began to realize it was going to be a big book, because there were lots of episodes, whether it was the debate about annexing Alaska, the debate about Hawaii, the debate about Santo Domingo. Suddenly I had to dive in to all these very, very interesting historical episodes, some of which really nobody had written about before.
In many ways, Charlie, the book was an eye-opener to me, because I did not realize the extent to which isolationism was baked into the DNA of the early republic. How early this starts. How does this start? What's the origin story here, Charlie? And how does this become so important as a tendency and a current in American foreign policy?
Well, it really goes back to the beginning of the Republic, Janice, when the United States was young and vulnerable and messed with by European colonial empires. The United States began life surrounded by the French and the British and the Spanish. And they got dragged into the French and Indian War even before the United States was independent. And as a consequence, they said, you know what? This isn't much fun. It's not very fun being tethered to a European great power. And so from the very beginning, the founders said that the United States should emerge as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but steer clear of entanglement further afield. And it was really George Washington in the farewell address of 1796 who put it rather plainly. He said, we want political connections with no one, even though commercial connections with everyone. And I'll just tell you a quick story to give you some sense of how powerful this isolationist urge was. The United States won the War of Independence largely because the French came across the Atlantic and helped us. And that was the result of an alliance that was struck in 1778. In 1793, not long after, Britain and France went to war again. And the French say to George Washington, our alliance with you still exists. We pulled your chestnuts out of the fire. Now it's your turn to help us. And what did George Washington do? He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. He committed a bald act of perfidy in 1793. And the next time that the United States formalized a military alliance with another country was after World War II. That's a long run, 1793 to the late 1940s.
That's a remarkable story, Charlie, because of course, we tend to think of the United States as the leader, first of the Western Alliance, and then more recently in the 90s, in the early part of this decade, of global alliances and coalitions of the willing. But that period is a very short period in American history. How did that play out in the 19th century as America became more mature, stronger, not so hassled by European powers, but that desire to stay unentangled, that comes out so strongly in the story you tell?
Well, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with the power of American exceptionalism. And we know American exceptionalism today as a narrative that justifies doing everything. We've got hundreds of bases around the world. We've spent the last 20 years trying to turn Iraq and Afghanistan into Ohio, right? Believing that they would want to follow the American way. Didn't work so well, but that's a separate issue. But prior to Pearl Harbor, and especially prior to 1898, the Spanish-American War, American exceptionalism was really the ideological foundation for isolationism, because the founders believed that ambition abroad would come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home, and they wanted the United States to be a model of democracy, of republican rule. They wanted the U.S. to change the world. They thought the U.S. was a chosen nation, but they wanted to change the world only by example. And exceptionalism came in lots of different flavors. For New Englanders, it was about enlightenment, the law of reason, of pacifism. For Southerners, it was about libertarianism. For many, it was also about racism, that the U.S. didn't want to expand into the Caribbean or Latin America or the Pacific because they didn't want non-whites coming into the body politic. So basically, there was something for everyone in this notion of American exceptionalism and isolationism. And that's one of the reasons it lasted so long. But you're right to say that things began to change in the 1890s. Isolationism worked very well. The U.S., rather than buying battleships and building colonies, was building railroads and factories and canals, and it was a booming success. So by the 1890s, you get leaders who are saying, okay, we've arrived. We've made it. We are a great power. Let's start translating our economic strength into military strength. And that's when you see the exceptionalist narrative begin to change. That's when McKinley says, President McKinley, let's take manifest destiny on the road. And that was his justification for picking a war with Spain to drive them out of Cuba.
Yeah, that is the first big turning point. Just before that, Charlie, did you, when you were doing your work on exceptionalism, which figures as one of your 5 or 6 big themes in the book. Did you get a whiff of the sense that the feeling was that American democracy was so exceptional that without doing much, the rest of the world would see and understand and emulate? Was there a kind of universalism already built into that exceptionalism, or it was just keep your hands off us, we'll keep your hands off you, and our democracy will flourish?
It was some of both, Janice. I think that early on, Americans were obsessed with the fragility and the vulnerability of democracy. If you go back and you read the Federalist Papers and the founders, they were very uncertain that the U.S. was going to make it, right? They thought that a big army and a big navy would eventually imperil American democracy. That's one of the reasons they didn't want to fight wars. They didn't want a big army and a big navy. They left the militias of the separate states to fight our wars. Many didn't want a central bank because they thought it would come at the expense of a federal republic. So for the early decades, Americans were much more worried that democracy would not survive in the United States than they were about spreading it overseas.
Looking at things, Charlie, I can't help but ask you, looking at things from the vantage point of 2021, were they right?
Well, sadly, Janice, there is a certain truth to it. I mean, as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., and has spent the last 4 years here, I can tell you that I never thought I would live through a period in American history like the one we just lived through. And I can also tell you that when Trump was elected and he gave his inaugural address, it so resonated with the history that I was writing. And that's because, in the first days, it was America First, going right back to the 1940s, the America First Committee. And most Americans were like, where's this coming from? But as someone who at the time was steeped in the 19th century, the isolationism, the unilateralism, the protectionism, the nativism, it was all there. And that's not because Trump reads a lot of American history. I don't think he does. It's because he tapped into a certain strain in American political culture that in some ways has never left behind that earlier tradition of American statecraft.
I think that's the power of your book, Charlie, that you take something that is so current, yet sounded so strange to so many Americans, and show, in fact, how when we go back and understand 18th and 19th century America, that was always there. That was always part of American culture. And in that sense, Trump wasn't exceptional.
I think that's right. And I'm not a big Trump fan, as you may know, but I think he was in many respects a very astute politician. And in 2016, when he was running for the presidency and after he became the president, he looked out at the American body politic and he sensed that many Americans were saying, too much world and not enough America, too many wars, too much free trade, too many immigrants, too many alliances. And you know what? He was right. That is exactly what many Americans felt. And I think that's why he was elected. Now, I think he overcorrected for that sentiment. And instead of easing off and bringing American commitments back into line with political will, he took a wrecking ball to the world America made. So his political instincts, in my mind, were actually quite acute. The problem is he didn't know how to act on his correct assessment of the body politic.
In the book, Charlie, you write about the Obama period as well, and you, of course, have firsthand knowledge of that period, and rightly say that the early signs of the retreat from the world are already there under President Obama. He really did try to end some of the entanglements, which the American public knew in this kind of intuitive, instinctive way were not going well and were not really doable. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. Now, you had a ringside seat, and he failed to do that. Why?
I mean, I think you're right to say that a President Obama was a retrenchment president. He wanted to scale back. He didn't want to do what Trump did, but he did want to modestly trim and to try to rebuild a brand of internationalism for which there would be strong support. And he had a real tough time doing so, in part because the Middle East wouldn't let go. Afghanistan was a mess, the Islamic State came back, and in part because he got a lot of pushback from the Pentagon and from a foreign policy establishment that really wasn't ready to let go. And in some ways, I think we're seeing today this struggle between a foreign policy establishment that is still committed to liberal internationalism, to Pax Americana, and a political system that is having second thoughts. One area where I think President Obama probably wasn't as aware of the problems as he should have been, or we should have been, since I was there at the time, is just how unhappy working America had become with globalization. I think we knew that there was a problem, but it wasn't until the Trump era that the profound sense of grievance, of dislocation, of alienation became clear. And now I think our task is not to turn our backs on the Trump era, but to learn lessons. And that's why I think President Biden is going to focus like a laser on the domestic front. Because if it's, we don't get the pandemic under control and invest in infrastructure, healthcare, education, whatever, we're not going to solve the fundamental problems that have become apparent during the last 4 years.
Charlie, just before we go to President Biden, I do want to go there because you have some very strong policy recommendations in the book. Let's go back just briefly to the period after World War II, when the United States did things that were totally out of character for what the United States had done before. It built in, and it's the era that, that this whole generation of the foreign policy establishment that you're talking about, 2 or 3 generations, grew up in. The United States built institutions, created permanent alliances, took on security obligations all around the world, got involved in a global struggle with the Soviet Union. What enabled that? Was it the fact that the old imperial powers that were familiar to Americans, the British, the French, the Spanish, were gone? Was it that the United States came out of World War II so powerful in relation to almost everybody else that the temptation was impossible to resist? Because what your book does so brilliantly is tells us that period, which we call the liberal international order, that was the exception. That's when America behaved in uncharacteristic ways. So what enabled that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start a tad before 41, because after World War I, which the United States successfully joined, Wilson takes the League of Nations to the Senate, and they get shot down 3 times. The Democrats then get pummeled in the 1920 election, and we start a long era of diluted isolationism, in which the United States runs for cover while Nazism and fascism sweep Europe and Asia. And there really was no appetite for repeating a war in Europe. And that's one of the reasons that Roosevelt, even though he's remembered as a great wartime leader, was basically in the isolationist mainstream until the war broke out, and really until Pearl Harbor. He was ready to aid the victims of Nazi aggression, but he wasn't ready to join the war. That all changes radically on December 7, 1941, and then isolationism is discredited, and the internationalists move to the center of the political spectrum. And I think that Roosevelt did several things that were kind of magical politically. One was that he, for the first time in American history, put together an internationalism that combined interests and values, that combined American power, but American power embedded in international institutions. And in doing so, he was able to bring along Republicans, who had really been the party of power since the 1890s, and the Democrats, who had become the party of multilateralism, also beginning in the 1890s. The second key is that, the war breaks out after a decade of the New Deal. And as a consequence, many Americans are feeling reasonably well off, and they buy the argument that Roosevelt makes that engagement abroad will strengthen prosperity at home. I think that in many respects, Roosevelt's real genius was not that he was a great wartime leader, even though he was. It was his ability to cobble together a bipartisan centrist coalition behind internationalism that lasted through the Cold War. That, in many respects, was his most important legacy to American politics.
It's a remarkable legacy, really. In that period, Charlie, do you sense that American thinkers, because worried less about democracy and the fragility of democracy, as you were describing Roosevelt's genius, you said he built the coalition around prosperity and connected prosperity to internationalism. Did a worry about how fragile U.S. democracy was, did that kind of fall off the desk during this period? Was there confidence in democratic institutions in the United States?
I think that confidence gelled over the course of the 19th century. And one of the reasons that the United States went abroad beginning in the 1890s was a sense that they had finished their mission at home. In fact, there was a historian who said, the frontier has closed. We have completed what we wanted to do here. Let's now go elsewhere. Let's bring civilization and democracy to others. And then it even gets more pronounced, Janice, in the period that you're talking about. And I think the evidence for that is that the imperial presidency takes over and Congress really steps away from the dominant role that it had played in foreign policy. Probably the key turning point was the Korean War, when Truman took the country to war without getting the approval of Congress. And ever since then, Congress in many respects has not been in the game. And it set the stage for what's happened in the last 2 decades, which is one war after another, all based on 2 pieces of legislation that were passed after 9/11.
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was the first one, which enabled a war which was as controversial in the late 60s and 70s as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were in these last 20 years. This is not the first time the United States, the American public, has turned against forever wars, Charlie.
And I think, coming back to a question you asked earlier, the founders were right. And the ambition of the country abroad has come at the expense of liberty if we measure it in terms of Congress abdicating its role when it comes to being the declaration of war and peace.
Let's fast forward now to 2021. We have a new president in the White House. And when I look at the United States as a friendly observer north of the border, I'm struck by how 2 of the themes in your book resonate in these early days of the Biden administration. One is Joe Biden himself, who was a skeptic of foreign engagement, even in the Obama administration, very much wanted to retrench, more so than did the president. And so this concept of a retiring United States, which makes much more strategic decisions about what advances U.S. interests, no longer the global policeman. That seems to be very much part of this new administration. It's not gone with Trump. The second is this new sense of the fragility of U.S. democracy, of U.S. institutions, the polarization, which is so sharp inside the United States right now, looks to the outsider like institutions under stress. What do you see this administration doing, given the convergence of those 2 themes, which are themes that are right through your whole book?
I agree with you that there is a certain continuity from the Trump era to the Biden era. And there is also a lot of discontinuity. I mean, I think there are two areas that immediately come to mind where there has been a stunning and much needed reversal. One is you again have someone in the Oval Office who is decent, who has integrity, who believes in the rule of law, and who will restore the United States as a country that plays by the rules of liberal democracy. Thank goodness.
Right.
The second is that the U.S. is again a team player. We now live in a world that is irretrievably globalized. The idea that we can pull out of the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization and every other pact we can find and deal with global problems, I mean, come on, right? So Biden has reversed those right on day one. But you're right. I think he does want to pull back, particularly from the Middle East. And 3/4 of the American public has said, let's get out of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's enough already. And so I think he'll continue to downsize the footprint. And then in some ways, and to me, this is the $6 million issue. It is to deal with the fragility of our democratic and economic institutions that has become so readily apparent. As I said, I have been shocked and terrified by what's been going on in this country. I never thought it could happen here. And I think when Biden said as a candidate, this is an election for the soul of America, he meant it. He completely meant that. And that's why I think what he's going to be doing now is putting a lot of effort into domestic repair, into dealing with the white working class, many members of which feel that they have been disenfranchised, that globalization hasn't worked for them. What is the common refrain of Biden and his foreign policy team? We need a foreign policy for the middle class.
How do you do that? How do you have a foreign policy for the middle class? That sounds like an economic foreign policy. It's got to bring economic benefit to a beleaguered, lower middle class. So what does that look like under the Biden administration?
For starters, I think it means trade deals that do much more for working Americans. The bottom line is most of the trade deals that the U.S. has negotiated have input from large corporations, but really no input from working Americans, from labor unions. And yes, they have lost jobs. Yes, they have lost wages as we have globalized. And so I think one thing you can do is make sure that their voices are present at the table and that when we negotiate trade deals, it works to the advantage of the lion's share of Americans and not just the 1 or 2% at the top. And that does mean standing up to China on trade, which Trump began to do. A second step, which I think is critical, is just realizing that domestic policy is foreign policy, and that building bridges, building infrastructure, in particular broadband in rural areas, giving people who used to have high-paying manufacturing jobs, good jobs that pay something similar to what they made, that's all part of foreign policy. Why? Because if they're feeling better, if the political center in America is coming back to life because people feel optimistic about the future, they're more likely to be outward looking. They're more likely to understand that engagement abroad is part of good politics and good policy. So I think it's both. It's a foreign policy that is sensitive to the needs of working Americans, but it's also investing domestically in ways that bring the political center in the country back to life.
Charlie, this book will be just of enormous interest to readers who care about international issues and domestic issues in the United States. What's one thing you would like readers of your book to take away from this immersive experience in American history that you've provided?
I would say that I would like for Americans, as well as others around the world, to be aware of the longer trajectory of American history, not just post-Pearl Harbor American history, with many of us are familiar with, but 1789 to 2021, not just 1941 to 2021. Because if they do, I think they'll better understand this country and what we're going through. And I think they will better understand the fragility of the world that we are in today, the contingent nature of American engagement in the world, the need to rebuild America from the inside out, because that's the beginning of getting American statecraft steady and purposeful again. So it's really, I think I tell an important story in the book that I would love for readers to become familiar with.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Such a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. That's one of the real bonuses of being chair of the jury, that I get to spend time with you. This is an important, beautifully written book about American history and about a theme in American history that most of us do not know enough about. So I can't recommend this book strongly enough to everyone.